Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to have today's session, in the sense that my foundation, Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies, have first opportunity to open this kind of academic sessions during the Jeju Forum. Uncertainty and unpredictability has been keywords to epitomize the current international situation, especially in Northeast Asia. North Korean nuclear issue has been epicenter of such disarray. Fortunately, we have Mar-a-Lago summit. Maybe there are many various comments on the result of the summit, but what's striking news is that first, North Korean nuclear issue has been the top priority between the summit, and second, they spent 3 hours to talk on North Korean peninsula issues. Maybe on the contents, many of our speakers will have comment on that. And the other fortunate thing is, in Korea, the presidential election minimized political vacuum situation. So with the popular vote of more than 83%, so maybe Korea will very swiftly secure the stability, and we expect more creative roles in the future. Without ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. But even though there are many hurdles and homeworks and difficulties or conundrums, but I'm very happy to invite the 7 the world-renowned, the best expert and speakers and scholars. So I want to call them invincible armada. So in North Korean nuclear issues. So if you do not make any solution, there's no solution. So as this morning, as Vice President Gore properly mentioned, revolutionary work should be started with some quiet and small talks. So in this sense, this kind of trilateral talk in whatever format, bilateral, track 1 or 1.5 track or 2-track base, I think the more the better. So I hope we will initiate such kind of good start. So today, for the housekeeping issues, I will give 5 to 7 minutes for initial presentation. But I highly encourage to use 5 minutes, but except the U.S. delegation, because they flied over more than 15 hours. So it might be reasonable discrimination, okay? But 5 to 7 minutes. And then in the meantime, there will be naturally, raise some questions. And then you might have some, I will give another chance, extra 2 minutes, chance to reply, if any. And then I will open the floors to all of you for the Q&A session. And and then after, during the Q&A session, you will have another 3 to 4 minutes, for the last, comment. Without ado, I'd like to introduce my first speakers, Mr. Gary Samos. He's now serving as Executive Director for Research at Welfare Center of Harvard University. And he served 4 years as President Obama's White House coordinator for arms control and weapons of mass destruction. On top of that, he also served almost same status, as a special assistant to the president and the senior director of non-proliferation and export control, in the White House, during the Clinton administration. Maybe because Doug has served in the same situation, in terms of serving in White House, almost same, status, but he represented, he served for Republican and he served Democrats. So maybe, so that's why I, invited both of them, to have more balanced approaches. So now the floor is yours. Okay.
Thank you very much. I want to, first of all, thank President Park and the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies for bringing together the Magnificent Seven to talk about this very difficult issue. So I think the election of President Moon Jae-in does create a new opportunity for the U.S., China, and Korea to coordinate strategy to address the North Korean nuclear and missile threat. As you all know, that wasn't possible previously because of the political vacuum and uncertainty surrounding the impeachment and the eventual dismissal of President Park Geun-hye. Now that ROK has an elected president, and now that plans are underway for President Moon to meet first with Trump and then later with President Xi Jinping, we now have all the players in office so that we can at least begin to fashion a coordinated strategy. I think there are two main questions for Washington, Beijing, and Seoul. First, can the three countries agree on a common approach to constrain North Korea's nuclear and missile program in the near term and create a process to begin to negotiate a comprehensive agreement for denuclearization in the long term? I think the answer is yes. The second question is, will this common strategy be effective with Pyongyang? Here I think the answer is much less clear, and probably no. With respect to the first question, the Trump administration's policies toward North Korea have sometimes appeared confusing and confused, often because of President Trump's stray tweets and press interviews. But behind this confusion, I think there is a strategy which has been reviewed and approved by the White House. It's called maximum pressure and engagement. And I think that makes sense. The administration is seeking to increase pressure in order to set up a new round of negotiations with North Korea. Of course, President Moon emphasizes engagement over pressure, but I think he can accept a U.S. strategy of increasing pressure to create conditions for negotiation. As President Moon said in his interview with the Washington Post on May 2nd, quote, Trump talks about strenuous pressure, sanctions, and even the possibility of preemptive strike. But I believe his ultimate goal is to bring North Korea back to negotiations for the nuclear program. I agree with President Trump's method of applying sanctions and pressure to North Korea to bring them out to negotiations, end quote. And of course, both President Trump and President Moon have said they're prepared to meet with Kim Jong-un under the right conditions. In a way, Kim Jong-un has done a favor to Washington by conducting a series of missile tests, one every week. We seem to be on a diet of one missile a week, because this forces both Seoul and Beijing to adopt a pressure-first strategy. It's difficult to imagine engaging in negotiations while North Korea continues a steady diet of missile testing. In response to these missile tests the last 3 weeks, the U.S. has proposed a new UN Security Council sanctions resolution to increase pressure on North Korea. But as I understand it, China is reluctant to support further UN action. In essence, Beijing seems to make a distinction between missile tests, which don't warrant additional UN sanctions, and a nuclear test, which would cause Beijing to support an additional sanctions resolution. The problem with this distinction between missile tests and nuclear tests is that it leaves Kim Jong-un free to conduct missile tests with impunity. So I hope that when President Trump and President Moon meet, they agree to joint efforts to increase pressure and persuade Beijing to support additional UN sanctions in order to set the stage for a return to negotiations. If Kim Jong-un decides to pause his testing campaign, having demonstrated that he has a credible intermediate range nuclear delivery capability, then the U.S., China, and Korea will have to consider conditions for resuming negotiations and what the elements and sequence of a proposed deal would be. What are we willing to give North Korea in terms of sanctions relief, economic assistance, security assurances, and so forth in exchange for limiting and eventually giving up its nuclear and missile program? As President Moon sketched out in his May 2nd Washington Post interview, I think Trump can accept a staged approach that would begin with a moratorium on nuclear and missile testing, then an interim stage preventing North Korea from advancing its capability, for example, a freeze on fissile material production, and finally a stage when North Korea gives up its nuclear and missile programs entirely. Presumably this final stage, which would likely take years to achieve, could coincide with a peace treaty, ending the Korean War, reciprocal diplomatic recognition by all parties, and security arrangements to maintain peace. In such an agreement, President Moon may be more willing or more generous to address North Korea's economic interests and security concerns than the last two Korean presidents. But in order to be an effective negotiator, President Moon will have to convince Kim Jong-un that he's not going to give any benefits of engagement unless he gets something in return from North Korea. So in conclusion, I think the U.S., China, and the ROK can agree on a coordinated strategy. But I have much less confidence that this strategy will actually work. It may be that Kim Jong-un is determined to continue testing until he demonstrates an ability to threaten the United States directly with a nuclear-armed missile. In that case, we'll be trapped in a cycle of testing and sanctions, just as we've been doing since the collapse of the Leap Day deal in April 2012. Of course, even if Kim Jong-un accepts a pause in nuclear and missile testing, there's no guarantee that a comprehensive agreement can be reached. The negotiations might break down after a series of frustrating meetings. And even if a comprehensive agreement is reached, we know from experience that Pyongyang can't be trusted to comply with the agreement or honor the agreement, especially if it requires something as difficult as giving up their nuclear weapons. Nonetheless, if we're able to achieve a temporary limit on North Korea's nuclear and missile program, that would help to address tensions and it would delay the program. And that may be the best that we can achieve through diplomacy at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. If I give some very quick question, but you don't have to reply right now. Okay. First, you implied some difference in approaching the missile issue and nuclear issues between China and the United States. But in case of the China seems much more focused on nuclear tests. But in accordance with our information, the utility of the nuclear test is usually focused on weaponization. I mean, of the warhead. So usually 5 years after first nuclear test, it could be done. But they already have passed 11 years. So why, the additional nuclear test, so important, from Chinese position? That is my first question. Second is, you just great elaboration on the President Moon's three-stage, stage-phased approaches. If we look back 20 years past history in dealing with North Korean issues, sometimes we have failed in the sense of postponing the final result to the last point, last stages. Sometimes phased approach was not so good because usually they want it might be used as a dragging tactics. So maybe it's not easy for us to identify what kind of policy is appropriate at a certain time. But what is your general observation on the three stages the approaches at this particular time, especially based on our 20 years negotiation experience with North Korea? Okay. You may give some comment later.
Okay.
Okay. Now, next speaker will be Vice President Doug Parr, at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As I told you, he served President Reagan and George Bush as the Director of Asian Affairs, and then as a Senior Director and a Special Assistant to the President. So, and also he has very colorful experience as a Vice Chairman of J.P. Morgan Chase International. So, and also he was an unofficial U.S. representative to Taiwan. So maybe against such colorful background, you could have some more colorful say on behalf of Republican. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Park. It's a delight to have an opportunity to cooperate with the Korean Foundation for Advanced Studies again, and with you personally. So I appreciate the invitation very much. My comments may not be colorful. The first thought that occurred to me as I listened to Gary Seymour's excellent presentation on the current position we find ourselves in dealing with the North Korean nuclear weapons threat is not of color but of tastes, and that this was like getting together with cooks. He has a recipe which has more salt than pepper, and mine has more pepper than salt, but we're talking about the same dish in the end, which is how do we get North Korea to adjust its approach to these weapons. After years of missed opportunities and failed promises, we are approaching the point of no return in North Korea's capacity to threaten its neighbors and the U.S. with its nuclear weapons. Time is short. If we're going to have the beginning of a solution, it has to start very soon, or we will be past that point of where we can return. Given the accelerating evolution of events, we have little choice to negotiate with Pyongyang on the basis of its existing capabilities at first. Several presidents have said that having a nuclear capability in North Korea is unacceptable. No one has been willing to say, well, we're about to accept it and move on to the next stage. We probably won't hear that for some time to come, and the hope is to avoid having to adjust that position. But it's becoming increasingly untenable to say something's unacceptable when the capabilities are being demonstrated before our very eyes. We have to place our hopes for the comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of the North Korean nuclear capabilities onto a long-term time horizon, and as Gary has said in his outline, step-by-step approach to get us ultimately to that policy outcome. So we have to focus on immediate objectives. Pyongyang's rapid progress in missile capabilities would be my first priority, with a view to arresting the testing as soon as possible. To put it simply, they're pretty far along with the nuclear weapons testing. They could probably do more, but they've got what they need. But the ability to toss a missile toward the United States to increase the range and reliability of their weapons systems has not yet been achieved. And so that, if I were to pick a target between the two, it would be the missile target as the first priority. This is, of course, to avoid reaching the threshold that may force Washington to think it must act before it is too late. We've had more talk of preemptive attacks from more people with 4 stars on their shoulders than I'd ever hoped to hear from Washington just in the last few months. And I think we need to find an agenda of activity that takes us away from that approach and to something more productive. Pyongyang should be encouraged to believe that its leverage will actually decline if it proceeds beyond the intercontinental delivery threshold. It currently seems to believe that that's the goal. You have to get to the holy grail of the delivery capability, and then its leverage will be unquestionable. We need to find ways to jujitsu this thought process and to show them that not only could it be better if you reach an agreement with us, it could also be much worse if you get past that threshold in capability. In summary, this is a question which is now or never. In light of the fact that North Korea's nuclear weapons tests and development are a more approximate threat to China today, and the missile threats are the enabling factor in the threat to the U.S., I think we might turn some of these, as Gary was describing, might be characterized as lemons, which is the Chinese are more interested in the nuclear question than they are the missile question, and we're concerned about how the leverage on both will be lost by focus on one or the other. I think we need to turn these lemons into lemonade and to find a way to create a division of labor between the United States and China, where China will, with all of its own interests at stake, focus its efforts on the containment and eventual rollback of the nuclear capability of North Korea, and the U.S. would concentrate its efforts on the missile threat. That's not to say they're both separate. They're going to be connected intimately. If we're doing this right, there'll be a tremendous amount of communication between China, the United States, and our ROK allies. And all of them would be working for the common purpose, but recognizing that within the common purpose there will be a division of roles. The U.S. and China should coordinate their approaches to maximize their effect, while South Korea can focus on inter-Korean tension reduction that does not undermine the international pressure on North Korea to address those concerns about nuclear and missile development. China has proposed suspension of the North's tensions in tandem with suspension of large-scale military exercises by the U.S. and the U.S. and South Korea. This has been a non-starter from the start, and there are good reasons for that. I was a part of the first team to start negotiations with North Korea on the nuclear question back in 1991, and it appeared at the time that it would be sensible for us to suspend our major military exercises in an effort to create a better atmosphere. We never got a better atmosphere, but we did have a diminished sense of our own capabilities as a result of failing to exercise. It's important not to conflate conventional and strategic weapons programs here, and that would be the essence of the Chinese proposal from Wang Yi and others, that the United States and South Korea suspend their activities. This is a foundational basis. Having said that, if we're going to start with North Korea, we're probably going to have to start on small things. The deficit of trust is so deep that we have to have very small building blocks toward greater trust and interaction, mutually beneficial interaction. And to get to that, we probably should take careful survey, again, all three parties, Beijing, Seoul, and Washington, surveys and have expert teams conduct surveys of upcoming activities short of major conventional exercises on the part of South Korea and the United States that we could offer as areas to show the beginnings of compromise, beginnings of trust building between the two sides, and in exchange for various kinds of suspensions of missile tests by North Korea. Proportionality and reciprocity should be the guiding principles, but a great deal would depend on the actual sit-down of the three parties before we approach North Korea to see what materially is on the agenda that we have to work with. As an outsider, I can't really say from this perspective. This would be the principle I'd proceed according to. The U.S., this means China should exploit its chokehold on support to North Korea to encourage it to extend its moratorium on nuclear weapons tests. I mean, China never says so and never will say so, but they seem to be holding back petroleum in exchange for the failure to test by North Korea. And that's what I mean by the chokehold. Conversely, if the North tests, China should exercise the chokehold to push Pyongyang to cease and ultimately reverse course. As small and intermediate steps are offered in this deliberately gradualist approach to a big deal, and if they produce worthwhile results, as Gary was suggesting, the three partners should then devise a larger maximal package of incentives to curtail and reverse the cycle of escalation on the peninsula. These should contain, as he said, this security, economic, and political elements in a coherent whole that will address Pyongyang's long-standing and long-voiced concerns. The North has shown in practice in the past that its demands tend to be unlimited and grow as they're satisfied on the first phase. They'll move on, and we have to go through a testing period to deal with that. Therefore, one goal should be to persuade the North that the international community at large has support for the large package that we want to put on the table, that it has credibility as an economic package, it has credibility as a diplomatic recognition package if North Korea follows through to completion. But it will also be important to prepare the ground for possible failure of a graduated approach and a division of labor approach, as I have outlined above. The partners should simultaneously be exploring the options to pursue if failure is the result. And these should include covert cooperation to deepen the constraints on and increase the threats to the regime. And here, in the spirit of past U.S.-China cooperation, I would point to very effective covert cooperation between the United States and China in dealing with Afghanistan in the 1980s. Getting back to that kind of cooperation will not be easy, but the stakes are so large that I think it should be an important part of our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Doug, maybe if we have some time, let's talk on the covert action, during the coffee time. If I raise very quick two questions. One is, you mentioned the division of labor between U.S. and China in between missile technology and the nuclear weapon program. But I think, even we could see in the case of re-entry, skill, that cannot be separated. So from my point of view, missile issue and the nuclear program should constitute an integral part, which cannot be separated. And then all countries concerned should take the same position. So, but what do you have special thing in your mind when you talk the division of labor? And also you mentioned on the South Korea's roles. So you suggest some inter-Korean tension reduction measures, but the situation is quite different in Geneva Agreement or even 2012 Lips Day Agreement. Time. The situation is quite different in terms of North Korea's capabilities. So, as of now, under the reinforced several, UN Security Council resolution. So, what kind of action Korean government could do? So, I think if I don't have to say on behalf of government, but government side, ask you. So maybe you may share some idea. Okay, next speaker will be Professor Jeju. He works as a professor and the dean of the School of International Studies of Peking University. He's so popular during the too many occasions, so I don't have to mention why he's so popular in Korea. And also, I want to introduce his special, features, political features, on top of his academic, performance. He's a member of the Standing Committee of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference in Korean, Cheonghyop. And a member of the Standing Committee of the Central Committee of the China Democratic League. which means democratic, equivalent of Democratic Party in the United States. Nobody believes that in China, Democratic Party is there. He is leading leadership, one of the leadership, of the, which is called Democratic parties. So that's why we expect more great, timely comment from you, as always with the case.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Park. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies for the invitation. I agree with most of Gary and Doug said. I think one of the most positive outcomes of President Xi and Donald Trump's summit at Mar-a-Lago last April is their agreement that the two countries should work more closely together to address the North Korean nuclear issue. President Xi expressed the view that there is a need to address the North Korean nuclear problem, and this need has acquired urgency as well as importance and necessity. This has led to rising expectation on the part of the outside world that China is going to pressure North Korea to give up nuclear weapons by all means. So President Trump's tweeters to praise President Xi on his agreement to help address North Korean nuclear problem helped fuel the expectations. Thus, recently, many people ask me, when China is going to stop oil supply to North Korea. And of course, many people inside China often ask me whether the U.S. will conduct a preemptive strike against North Korea, with China's acquiescence. Okay. Personally, I think it is quite dangerous to expect too much, because it can only lead to disappointment, and disappointment is bad for cooperation. Okay. This is because cooperation can only proceed when the parties concerned have realistic expectations of each other and seek pragmatic solutions together to deal with the problem. So what are the realistic expectations about China or North Korea? I think they may include the following. First, no war. Because the cost of a war, preemptive or not, is prohibitive. Okay. From the Chinese perspective, it means maybe a nuclear accident, a nuclear conflict, and as well as a conventional war, a civil war in North Korea. And also it may mean a huge humanitarian disaster. It can also lead to some other things like refugee problem and great negative implications for Chinese economy, especially in China's northeast. Second, probably China would continue with existing sanctions and increase them over time if North Korea conducts another round of nuclear tests, or maybe a series, too many missiles, even though we don't attach as much importance to the nuclear, the missile tests as the nuclear tests. And also more likely, China is likely to entertain the idea of bilateral and trilateral dialogues on all kinds of issues, including contingency plans. Okay. I think if it is urgent, then we need to deal with the problem. And crisis can happen anytime. We don't want to make quick decisions during crisis. In the past, China has resisted to the idea, but now basically China is saying that it's becoming more urgent. Then, probably China, I think, is more inclined to engage in such kind of dialogues in the days to come, maybe sooner or maybe later. And also, China, in addition to the contingency plans, probably we need to have talks about ways to address the North Korean nuclear challenge, and also post-North Korean political arrangements. Okay. You never know what's going to happen, and maybe Kim Jong-un can last forever, but you never know. Okay. And also, more likely, China is going to entertain the idea of a five-party talk to discuss and explore ways to address the North Korean nuclear issues and post-North Korean political settlements. Maybe to use it as some kind of political pressure on North Korea to come back to the negotiation table. And finally, probably China would urge different parties to put together an attractive package of incentives for North Korea if the latter comes, by any chance, agrees to come back to the negotiation table, accepting some kind of a program of denuclearization. Okay. What are the realistic expectations about South Korea's approach to the North Korean nuclear issue? I think mostly similar to those of China. Okay. Even though the question of no war, our calculus may be a little bit different because Seoul is so much exposed to North Korean conventional attack. To South Korea, war is not an option at the moment. Probably even in the days to come. Okay. I talked to one senior official of South Korea. I asked him, can you, stop, destroy all the artilleries pointing at Seoul in the first strike? He said no, no guarantee. And then what about the nuclear weapons? Can you destabilize them, in the first strike? No. So as long as these two problems cannot be resolved, I think probably South Korea would resist the idea of a preemptive strike. Okay. What about the U.S.? I think the U.S. at the moment probably would also say no to a preemptive strike, for different reasons. I think it's it's because of South Korea would be attacked and would suffer, and as well as U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. It's still the cost of a preemptive strike is still prohibitive. But so in the short run, I think all the three parties, okay, probably can agree with all these, with the five I listed, options I listed. Maybe China would, but they have to make efforts to reach some kind of a consensus. I think China has to probably take one step forward, especially when we engage in bilateral, trilateral talks on contingency plans. Okay. In the long run, however, things may change when North Korea acquires long-range missile capabilities that can reach the U.S. Okay. This may change the U.S. calculus of the cost. So probably at that time, the U.S. will be more inclined to take the military option to launch a preemptive strike against North Korea. At that particular moment, then China and South Korea would face a very difficult decision, okay, whether to support the U.S. or not to support the U.S. on this issue. Okay. I hope that we are not going to reach that stage. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your some suggestion of some possible scenario in the future we should take. If I'd like have some focus on the all kinds of contingency plan. So maybe among some academic, discussion, some Chinese side implied some possibility of Chinese Liberation Army might have some infiltration, intrusion of at least 50 kilometers into North Korea in case of contingency, in North Korea to protect. To establish some camp to accommodate the refugees, erupted from various parts of North Korea. So I wonder if there's any this kind of thing might be included in which you mentioned all kinds of contingency plan. And the second question is, you suggested 4 to 5 excellent options. From my point of view, if something as Gary implied, if our expectation has been futile and abortive, and eventually North Korea will really cross the red line. In that case, Professor Jia Jin-go mentioned some going war or some other options. But from my personal idea is that you missed another option, that is Korea's going nuclear. So even as of now, 62% of the people is supporting that options. But if everybody believe that now we are in a desperate situation, well, we cannot count on anybody. We cannot trust China, no United States. In that case, we have to depend on our own muscle. So it's very natural, result of the people's desire. I don't know, when people will have such kind of things, and then what kind of situation will, satisfy such, criteria. But, we have to think about as an option, in some cases, in case of in desperate situation. So maybe I don't try to limit to anybody, to Professor Jia. Any friends from Chinese side may respond at a proper time. So my list, I'd like to invite next speakers. Professor Zhang Yunling. He is a professor of the International Economics, Academy of Members of the Director of the International Studies, Chinese Academy of Social Science. Chinese Academy of Social Science, as all of you are well aware, it is the most powerful and influential and think tank with great manpower of more than 10,000 PhD, if my memory is correct. And he's enjoying the various background, in various, the areas, including member of National Committee of Chinese Political Consultant Conference, former director of the Institute of Asia Pacific Studies, and also he is chairman of the research centers on China-Korea relations, Shandong University from last year. So, and then also he's unsung heroes in drafting and coming up with one belt, one road design. So maybe I invite you to the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Park. I was trained as an economist. Economists think things always based on the rationale, but things come to the nuclear Northeast Asia relations, it seems not rational at all. So after listening to the three previous speakers, I have to rewrite some points of that, not to repeat what they talk about. Some points. The first one, I think there seems emerged new consensus that is relating to Northeast Asia, especially the Korean Peninsula issue, and that is North Korea nuclear threat is immediate, it's real, and we have to take the actions together. The second, I think, new consensus is we have to find by our best that to solve it peacefully, not by a war, because every side realize that war is so dangerous. So, but the problem, I think, that seems to many Chinese, President Trump put too much hope on China only, because it, for instance, a few days ago when North Korea launched the several missiles, and then he wrote a Twitter said, "Oh, it's North Korea just not to give the face to President Xi." It seems, this is China's problem. And I think it's put too much hope on China's role and will not solve the issue at all, because as Fu Ying just published a long article, elaborates the history of this, the problems come to the current situation. That's one point. I think that's also the danger, the risk, to put too much hope on China, on President Xi. The second point, that is the consensus with different especially for China, also for the others, different perspective and different concerns. And China, of course, strongly and firmly oppose North Korea nuclear, but at the same time also worried about the U.S. strategic intention, employment in the region. And like MD and the third related to MD issue, and China is worried. That is why THAAD become a big problem. That is why, China ROK relations suddenly turned to a very bad structure, and because the THAAD is employed in South Korea land, and so and worried about the future. So facing this such a kind of situation, seems there is a new hope. That is, the President Moon was elected, and too much hope on him to have a quick, sudden, and improvement of bilateral relations, and too much hope on him to suspend the THAAD in Korea. And even many Chinese, or some of them at least, the tourist companies now preparing for a big team of tourists and so on. So too much hope. The first too much hope, and the second too much hope, and I think it's not an easy thing, and to solve this issue, and if it's not quickly solved, and that's also again, and make people disappointed, and the mood, the emerging good mood may be changed. So whether it's possible for China, ROK, think or design or work together beyond thought, I don't know. But this is an issue to be thought about. Third point I try to mention, that is, as mentioned by Professor Jia, that Moon's government shares more common in China's strategy on the Korean Peninsula, Northeast Asia. But on the one hand, President Moon has difficulty to move as what he wished to. On the other hand, that is, I think, facing the nuclear command immediate of the threat, whether his government could really conduct the policy through this engagement, improvement, and then go to the improvement of a situation and let North Korea back to the table. It's not clear. And also we see some probably the differences between ROK new government and the Trump administration. And so because President Trump seems too much rely on this further comprehensive pressure as a way for change. And so still we see some differences between the two. I don't know that is forthcoming summit could meet their differences. Lastly, how to do? It's a hard question to be answered. One, I think, is just 2 points. One point is concerning China-U.S. ROK relation, and I think there are 2 forthcoming summits. One is with the United States, one with China. So whether through these 2 forthcoming summits we can have 3 trilateral, have more consensus on how to do. But the question is on what? On what we can get more consensus to do. And also, for instance, whether we can, how long can continue this kind of pressure for change. Because it seems until now, North Korea would not accepted any kind of signal sent from President Trump, from China, from ROK, and continue to test the missiles, and including the said next week or launch long-range missiles, and the especially new nuclear test. And if we really have a new nuclear test, whether it's a big turn, and the new consensus will immediately broke up, or there is still the danger. And also, a few days ago, and Russia made a joint statement. They jointly stated the peace is the only solution for Korean Peninsula issue. So whatever happened, they must have refused any kind of military actions. So some, still sees on the face, we have a new consensus, we have a new understanding, but how to conduct consensus, strategies, and China, U.S., Korea, although do not forget Russia, and probably to some extent Japan, and work together. And especially how to get along of North Korea to understand or accept the signal we sent. And until now, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zhang. And next speaker will be Zhang Tosong, who is work as a senior fellow and chairman of the academic committee of the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at China Foundation for International and Strategic Studies. Previously, he was Deputy Defense Attaché at the Chinese Embassy in UK, and also he is a research fellow in the Institute of Strategic Studies of People's Liberation Army National Defense University. So he is very specialized in security issues. Professor Zhang.
Yeah. Thank you. I will focus on two issues. The first is about the nuclear crisis, and the second is about how to solve and control the third issue. My American colleagues and Chinese colleagues have said a lot about the first issue. I just add several points. First is now in China, especially in the academic circle, so the people has become more and more clear that the top priority is the denuclearization. In the past, China always said keep peace and stability and denuclearization. So which is the number one goal? So I think now most people believe without denuclearization, there would be no peace and development. That's become more clear. Secondly, so what is the most urgent thing? I think two. The one is try best resume the talks. Give the talk another try. It's very, very important. And so maybe the urgent goal in the future, that is to freeze the nuclear program. Then maybe we can give North Korea some security guarantee. And another urgent thing is try our best to strengthen the crisis management, to prevent accidental military conflict and war. If any war happened, it would be a disaster, not for all the countries here or for the region. And maybe there could be a nuclear war. So we must try our best to avoid it. Second is, in the past, China always said, U.S. and North Korea is two major players. So both of you should play a big role to solve this. China tried to supply a platform and something like that. But now modern people believe China should play a big role. Otherwise, we can't solve this problem. But at the same time, we still believe without the compromise between U.S. and North Korea. For example, if U.S. would not like to make any compromise to North Korea, we can also can't solve this problem. So recently, the four no's mentioned by Tillerson has been welcomed by China, and that's very important. Another thing is how to resume the talks. China has given a lot of proposals, and China has become more flexible. In the past, we said the six-party talks is the best platform. But now we said two-party, three-party, four-party, including the five-party, is okay if it's beneficial for the peace and stability and denuclearization. So I have a concrete proposal here. That is, maybe, yes, we can have a two-party, three-party talks. But at the same time, maybe we can think whether we can just propose that on the basis of September 19th joint statement, this should be the basis. All the parties who agree to this, who think it's very important, should immediately sit together to have talks. If all the parties think we can sit together, okay. But maybe North Korea will not, because they think North Korea is a nuclear state now. Okay, we can keep a seat there, over there. Welcome, they join us anytime. But this is we have a very good basis, and we have the six-party framework. But at the same time, the other 5 should sit together to talk a lot of things. How to realize the UN sanctions against North Korea, how to prevent another nuclear test, and the ICBM test, a lot of things, and crisis management, and how can we establish a package of solution in the long run. So anyway, for 8 years without any multilateral talks, it's one of the reasons that the crisis go up again and again. Finally, I totally agree with Jia Qingguo's point. Maybe in the near future, it's time for us to begin the talks about how to deal with the contingency in the Korean Peninsula. So my proposal is now maybe it's still not very easy for the government, maybe for Chinese government to accept it. It's very sensitive. But at least we should establish some conditions for on what kind of situation we should, 3 of us should immediately sit together to talk about how to deal with the contingency. And before that, maybe we can have 1.5 track talks. Finally, I want to say several points about the THAAD, because I think the THAAD issue has become not only damaged relationship between China, US, China, ROK, and also become an obstacle to the efforts to deal with the Korean nuclear issue. So I have several proposals. First, I think we should unify the understanding to regard the denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula as the #1 issue. So we'll try our best to avoid let the third issue to become the obstacle of our cooperation. Secondly, so maybe China and the United States and South Korea should mutually respect and honor the other side's security concern. China should, yes, we can understand your concern. You have concerns about North Korea's nuclear missiles and nuclear. And China has our concern. So US and South Korea will also honor our concern. So at this starting point, so we should find a way to solve and control the disputes. That's very important. The third point is, if United States and South Korea could decline, that you will suspend and delay the deployment. It would be good, not only for more help, for more efforts from China on dealing with the nuclear issue. Also, it could be I think it could be a good thing for try to resume the talks with the North Korea. But if we can solve this issue, especially if North Korea have new nuclear test and the new ICBM test, so I think we should put the confidence building measures and the difference management and the crisis management on the agenda. That's very, very important. Both sides can do some mutual security commitment, such as I think the US and South Korea can formally declare that the THAAD will never aim at China and agree to establish some maybe verification measures. So, and also, South Korea can reiterate its position, that is, will never join the joint military missile defense system, regional, that's TMD, US, Japan, South Korea, maybe in the future more countries. And thirdly, and following the solution of the nuclear North Korean nuclear issues, or maybe if there is a freeze I hope United States and South Korea can say we would like freeze and finally withdraw all the THAAD system. And as a response, maybe China can make a commitment. That is, if you did this, China should have some preventive and countermeasures, but it should be a moderate response to that. Yeah, it should be a reciprocity, just like this, not cover everything, and not damage the overall relationship with South Korea. That's very, very important. Besides, I think U.S. and South Korea can also take some technical measures. For example, you can provide some technical data to China. And also, if you can think about changing the radar, that's the most important thing that China have concerns, the system. Or maybe you can fix radar's direction, all this is technical measures, but it's helpful. And finally, I think all these efforts need talks and consultation. So 3 countries should establish talks and consultations and keep it. It's very, very important. Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you, Professor Zhang, for your very comprehensive and succinct elucidation on your proposal. If I just add one questions on your first issues. Now, North Korea nuclear issues became top issues even within the China. But unfortunately, if my memory is correct, and in the year of 2009, during the Hu Jintao regime, the party made a great decision. That Chinese government will prioritize peace and security of Korean Peninsula over denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. So that decision, even though it's not openly revealed, it gave some long signal to North Korea that, by feeling that denuclearization might be, they feel some comfort zone, or they might regard that decision as safe conduct, for their further action. So I think my idea is that now it's high time for China officially declare, by the party's decision. I mean, especially, through the party of the parties, the diplomatic leaders meeting in Chinese, 中央外事领导小组. So that is good signal that Chinese government has really changed its position. That's my first, comment. The second comment is, I appreciate your proposal on how we could solve the THAAD issues. But I have a little resistance on your argument in saying that, when you say that the third issue might be linked with the North Korean nuclear issues. So I think this issue is nothing to do with North Korean involvement in this issue. So it should be purely discussed and solved between China and the United States and Korea. So otherwise, the sad issues became good. Another additional pretext for North Korea to continue their nuclear program. So maybe in that sense, we should be very vigilant and careful, in that sense. Anyway, thank you for your very candid, suggestion. If I, have an additional question to U.S. side, he suggested some working levels, talk on the technical issues. So maybe no, any from the American expert will make some comment later. Okay. So now I have to invite our Korean side, expert. First speakers will be Professor Yoon Young-kwan. He's a professor emeritus at Seoul National University, and he previously, as Minister of Foreign Affairs, he was my immediate boss. And then, maybe, and also he's enjoying really various academic, position. On top of, especially I'd like to pay attention to the position as co-chair of the East Asia Vision Group from September 2011 to 2012. So maybe I hope you will give another elucidation on your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Park, for your very kind introduction. And since time is short, I'd like to make a brief comments on this subject. I'd like to begin by making a few comments on the general political environment in terms of international political situation as well as regional political situation overall. First, President Trump. President Trump doesn't seem to be interested in taking the leadership role in support of a liberal international order, and he's pursuing America First policy. And if he continues this policy for the remaining 4 years or even 8 years, then the legacy will be serious. And probably every country will follow the suit of America First policy, and then the situation will become similar to the 1930s. I mean, the age of leadership vacuum. Professor Kindelberg explained that the confusion in the 1930s was mainly because of the lack of international leadership. And we may be going toward that direction if Donald Trump continues his America First policy in coming 4 or 8 years. Some people are talking about a kind of middle power concert. For example, countries like India, Japan, South Korea, Australia, these countries may have to try harder to cooperate with each other and to provide international public goods. But it will take some time to establish an effectively working middle power concert. And the region we are living, Northeast Asia, cannot wait that long because international relations in this region is much more volatile and unstable compared to other parts of the world. As we all know, Northeast Asia has been suffering the problem of so-called a security dilemma for a long time, and America has been taking an important role as a stabilizer. And if President Trump gives up that role in Northeast Asia, I think there will be rising arms race, and probably countries like Japan and South Korea and some other countries may consider a nuclear program. And it will be much worse world than the current situation. And of course, it was fortunate to witness President Trump changed his rhetoric toward a positive direction, and he and his staffs made some comments, positive comments regarding reassurance of security on the Korean Peninsula or something like that. But there is one thing I'm concerned, that is alliance relationship is being managed by a different way, in a different way, by President Donald Trump. It tends to be more based on economic transaction rather than being based on shared common vision. If this is the case, the alliance will be more vulnerable in the future to the outside factors, and it will become less resilient. So this is another negative factor of President Trump's foreign policy. Excuse me if I sounded too pessimistic, but that's what I believe, frankly speaking. Finally, on North Korean nuclear issue, I think President Trump is going to the right direction by emphasizing the necessity of pressuring North Korea to the maximum and engaging North Korea. And he has been relying on China very much, and China has been implementing what was agreed in the last summit meeting at Mar-a-Lago, Florida. And President Trump has been sending to North Korea some signals for dialogue, and nowadays not a few specialists or former policymakers are arguing for a deal, making a deal, which is based on freezing nuclear and missile capability of North Korea. Gary also mentioned about this kind of deal. And they say that it is better to pursue an imperfect but more realistic, more realistic deal, starting from freezing all the nuclear and missile capability of North Korea at the current level, and probably later pursue the final denuclearization of North Korea. They simply believe that a full rollback of North Korean nuclear project to zero nuclear warheads will be probably unrealistic, because Kim Jong-un would never accept that idea. But there's some defects of that proposal, because the criticizers of that idea argue that beginning from freezing may amount to accept North Korea de facto nuclear state, like Pakistan. And we will not be able to verify freeze, since we do not know how many nuclear warheads, how many enrichment plants North Korea has, and where they are located. We have no idea. And North Korea will never accept intrusive inspection by IAEA. So, there's an important homework for the new Korean government to do. That is to decide whether Korea should accept this proposal based on freezing or not, because it has a weakness and strengths at the same time. So our policymakers will have to be very prudent in deciding what kind of position South Korea will take. But in case South Korea takes the idea of freezing, then South Korea will also have to consider what kind of additional concrete security assurance of the United States they will have to ask, because South Korea will be vulnerable, because North Korea may continue to own a dozen or 2 dozens of nuclear warheads, and they can attack South Korea. So we need some kind of concrete measures to be taken for extended deterrence. And finally, I think another important homework for the new Korean government will be peace agreement. any kind of peace settlement should be done through a peace agreement, and it's very complicated and important subject. First, we still do not know whether North Korea will change its traditional position arguing for withdrawal of American troops from the Korean Peninsula. That's one key factor. And if they, give up that kind of traditional argument, what kind of roadmap we will prepare in advance? I think that's a very important issue because our political leaders have been always saying that Korea should lead international diplomacy leading to a peace on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you. The last, not least, speaker will be Professor Jeon Jae-sung. He is working at Seoul National University, and also he is one of the leading scholars in academia, in a think tank, as a chair of Center for International Relations Studies of East Asian Institute. Professor.
Thank you. I have 2 or 3 points. I'll try to be brief. First thing is that from South Korean perspective, I think the nature of North Korean nuclear problem is changing because with the enhancement of North Korean nuclear capability, both the United States and China think that North Korean nuclear threat is their own problem. They're threatening, for the United States, the continental America, and because, as the North Korean nuclear problem becomes worse, we have to strengthen our alliance relations with the United States, which is a threat to Chinese, their own direct security. So when we talk about South Korean passing, for example, I think it is not just because both the United States and China try to bypass South Korea, but the nature of the North Korean situation is changing. So how to combine, all these different concerns into a consensus will be a critical question. But the good thing is that because great powers think North Korean nuclear problem is their own security problem, we may have some kind of clue or lead in solving the problem. Because so far we could not solve this problem because all these neighboring great powers have different strategic calculus in looking at this problem. They think status quo is sustainable to their own interests. So they are thinking differently. They have a higher priority in dealing with this question, providing more policy means. The result is that we have some kind of similar formula in solving this problem. They both talk about, to both China and the United States, pressure and engagement. And our government, Moon government, is also begins to talk about staged, phased and comprehensive approach, which means that we have to combine anyway pressure and engagement. The details are different, but we are talking about the same, some kind of similar formula. Then the question is pressure and economic sanctions. To North Koreans, North Korean nuclear weapons is, I think it's a matter of life and death. Kim Jong-un thinks this weapon very seriously for his own biological life and also the system of North Korea. So only when we reach at the level where we can threaten really life of Kim Jong-un, then Kim Jong-un may think about changing his strategic calculus. Even though we maximize, as the United States says, even though we maximize our pressure, if we fall short of threatening Kim Jong-un's, a lot of, political benefits, then we cannot achieve our purpose. The problem is China's calculus, as we know. I'm not blaming China, but China wants to maintain North Korea as a strategic buffer, which is also very natural to China. But the problem is we cannot reassure China of our genuine intention that we will not pursue North Korea's collapse. It's very hard for China to believe that. So how can we achieve that? The maximum level of pressure, economic sanctions upon North Korea. The only way is that we have to show to China that our own national interest is to make North Korea persist to some extent, where we can have peaceful inter-Korean relations. We cannot just say to Chinese that we will not pursue the sudden collapse of North Korea. So help us in ratcheting up our pressure and sanctions, which is quite implausible. The second thing is that if Kim Jong-un just continues to develop ICBMs and even SLBMs, then we have to imagine the situation where we have to live with ICBM-equipped North Korea. Then we will have a lot of problems. For example, there will be a decoupling problem between South Korea and the United States. South Korea may talk about going nuclear, or United States may strengthen the secondary boycott, which will have bad impact upon Chinese position. That will have a very complex situations after North Korea succeeds in developing ICBMs. But I think if that situation comes, I think we have to stay very calm, and then still deal with North Korea. Then I think the Trump administration should deal with American public, which will be quite much, fearful of North Korea's attack, and also reassure South Korea that we will continue, the United States will continue a security commitment, which I think President Trump is not ready for, for those the jobs. The last point is about engagement. All three countries are talking about engagement, but I think United States is only talk about minimum level of engagement. China, I think their idea is kind of vague. Well, we have pursued South Korea the Sunshine Policy, but I think North Korea has their own concerns of being engaged, because being engaged may mean that being observed to South Korea's system. So if we don't have a very detailed program of engagement where Kim Jong-un can maintain his own regime, then I think we will fail. So there is a hidden agenda in engagement, how to sustain a dictatorship for the party of Kim Jong-un. So unless we provide Kim Jong-un with very detailed engagement program from all three countries about you can sustain your dictatorship for the time being, and then you can normalize your relations with surrounding countries. Then he may think about changing his own strategic calculus. So we have to both maximize pressure and maximize engagement, which we are not ready for yet. The last problem is a sequencing problem. So I think North Korea has a lot of options. If there is too much pressure on North Korea, Kim Jong-un may pretend to participate in the negotiations for freezing with some idea of denuclearization. But after some rounds of negotiations, he may withdraw, which happened a lot in the past. Then we have to maintain, still the common front of pressure and economic sanctions, but it will be very hard after one round of failed negotiations. So even though that happens, we have to be prepared for a long term of sequencing in dealing with both denuclearization and how to engage with North Korea.
Thank you, Professor. Now I give the maximum 2 minutes for everybody. If you have something to reply, okay.
So you asked me why China puts more priority on nuclear tests over missile tests. I think it's a very good question, because if I was China, I would worry more about missile tests. It's missile tests which led to the decision by the ROK to deploy THAAD, and as long as North Korea continues to test missiles that can threaten Korea, it makes it impossible for President Moon to suspend or reverse the THAAD decision. And eventually, if North Korea acquires the ability to threaten the United States with long-range missiles, that will increase pressure on the ROK and Japan to develop nuclear weapons, which China obviously doesn't want. So I think it's a good question for our Chinese colleagues. Why does the Chinese government seem to be more concerned about nuclear tests than missile tests? The second question you asked was why a phased approach? And I agree with Professor Yun and Professor Chun that a phased approach is the only realistic option we have available. It simply is not plausible that we could compel or induce Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons in the near term. And as I said in my talk, I think even a phased approach, I think even achieving a freeze is a pretty unlikely prospect. I think it's worth trying. I think we might get a freeze on testing. But as Professor Yun said, there are so many deep challenges to a real freeze, including verification. And for that matter, Kim Jong-un may not think he has enough nuclear weapons yet. I mean, we don't know what his strategic calculation is. He may feel he needs 100 or 200 nuclear weapons before he can accept a freeze. So I don't think a freeze is plausible in the near term, but I think we should try to do it. I think it's our best option.
Thank you. You asked about what I had in mind in terms of covert action. And the model for me there are two models. One is in early 80s, after the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, the United States CIA director, President Reagan, and as it happens, a helpful Pope John Paul II, launched a massive covert action problem to undermine the stability of Eastern Europe. Now, the circumstances are almost completely different, but I think the concept of action is the thing to talk about here. And there are avenues for action, and they're not easy to arrive at. One of them, for example, is there is a limited number of nodes by which internet connectivity occurs between North Korea and the rest of the world, and China has a handle on all of them. Now, if we can get over our mutual suspicions in certain areas, which I think is possible theoretically, if not practically, we might be able to do some things together that could be very beneficial to increase pressure on North Korea. You asked me in the earlier set of questions about the division of labor. Can the issues of nuclear weapons and missiles really be separated? Of course not. They cannot really be separated. But I think there's an imbalance of fervor. The Chinese are more interested in nuclear, and if they're more interested, they may be willing to put more on the table to help us get there. But I think, and we've got an interest in not having the weapons reach our own territory, or our allies' territory, including South Korea. So there are definitely inseparable components, but we ought to be able to play to our division of labor on this, on the principle that one will not undermine the activities of the other. And that's a very important part of the initial consultations. And on the question of whether, what can the inter-Korean dialogue do, I think there's a lot to do here. I would start with resumption of something like the past history of CIA or KIS chiefs meeting their counterparts in North Korea. The North has always been more willing to talk on that basis than in others. And we have some initial exploration there. Even within the sanctions regimes, I think there are things that can be done between the two Koreas that could open the possibility of discussion, and more importantly, the possibility of an economic cooperation together with the major powers' discussion of a peace arrangement that should be put on the table. Like Gary Seymour, I think I like Gary. I'm skeptical we're going to get to that result. But if we want to carry international opinion with us to go to higher measures of pressure and action against North Korea, it's important that we do the most upfront so people see that we've proceeded with it as much good faith as can be plausibly demonstrated to the international community.
Thank you. With regard to PLA's contingency plan, I don't know very much about it.
Go ahead.
But I think all the militaries were concerned have their contingency plans. I think it's important for us to share our options, or at least to talk about options and how to coordinate in the time of crisis. in order to avoid accidental conflicts that will be detrimental to our own interests. What about nuclear option for South Korea? Well, I think probably as long as the U.S. Gives the nuclear protection to South Korea, there is no need to rush for that because it's highly risky. And also, basically, you get into a North Korea position, and that's not good. And also, even if Donald Trump doesn't want to extend the cover, the umbrella, nuclear umbrella to South Korea, China, maybe the Russia, may be alternatives. I think they probably would have the interest to provide the necessary protection so as to avoid nuclear proliferation. I mean, we haven't explored that yet, that option yet, but it's possible.
Professor?
No question on me, but I think, as I mentioned, since seems we have consensus on the major understanding of issues, but still various different, perspectives and strategic thinking. So what I proposed is probably the time for. I agree with the person that proposal. Probably the time for ministers and to get together and leave a chair there and talk about that how we do together on the same front and what's a priority and at the same time what we can provide, which can lead North Korea to reconsider its ongoing agendas. Thank you.
Two questions for me. The first, I think, yes, China should send a more clearer signal to the North Korea. And at least I think now, not just the scholars, also the foreign minister, Wang Yi, had said several times that there's no denuclearization. We can achieve peace and stability. And if one day the top leader can say something, it would be better. And another thing is, I agree that it shouldn't be a principle that link the third issue and the denuclearization issue. Because China and the United States and South Korea have a common interest to solve the nuclear issue. And so we shouldn't link these two things. But just now my point is it's a fact. Because of the third issue, it has increased the difficulties between our two countries, China and ROK especially, and has become to some extent an obstacle to the cooperation. So we should change this. We must solve and manage the third issue. Finally, I want to say one thing. As Gary said, it seems to U.S. just focus on the ICBM. China focus on nuclear. Yeah, I don't know whether it's true or not, but I can tell you one thing. That is, yes, nowadays in China, modern people have concerns about the nuclear weapons in the Korean Peninsula, because the nuclear weapons, because without ICBM, they can't attack U.S. Yeah, but if there is a war and a nuclear war happened in the Korean Peninsula, China is just a neighbor. So it would be a disaster for China. And also nowadays China has more concerns about the nuclear security issue and the nuclear safety issue, because all the nuclear instruments just near the border of China. The ordinary people have serious concerns about that. And so maybe that's one of the reasons. But I think also China should have concerns about the missiles. I agree.
Let me briefly mention about a third issue, since Mr. Chang To-sheng mentioned about that. We do respect to what he said. I would like to tell that the same applies to China. What I'm saying is Mr. Chang mentioned that South Korea had better honor the security concern of China, but I'd like to say that China had better honor security concern of Korea, because North Korean threat is a matter of life and death to almost every, Koreans living here. And we, made we tried our best to explain that expanded radar covers only 800 kilometers, not 200 kilometers. So it cannot technically cover China. And it is very difficult and takes time to switch from 800 kilometers to 2,000 kilometers. You have to move the machine to Boston and fix, the hardware of the radar and come back to Korean Peninsula to switch that. So, Chinese military may be able to recognize what is going on with expanded radar here, because the radars are already covering whole range of Korean Peninsula. We all know that. And it is a little curious why China has not been protesting hard as they did regarding THAAD on two expanded radars deployed in Japan, which have been covering China for a long time. So, that's what I'd like to.
Okay. Professor.
Yes, two short points related to that issue. I think we have to show North Korea that developing North Korea nuclear weapons will not make North Korea safer. I think only for the purpose of deterrence, I think North Korea's long-range artillery is enough. So we have to outpace our efforts, even though North Korea develops all those nuclear weapons and missiles, we have to show that we are prepared to, do more. We can, have a much more advanced deterrent power. Then North Korea may feel their missiles' futility and then try to change their minds. The second thing is, I think, not just South Korea, but all East Asians want to really see Trump's East Asia policy. We know that there was a comprehensive review of North Korea nuclear policy, but not really about, Korea Peninsula or East Asia in general. So if there is no manifest kind of East Asia policy, North Korea will think that United States may retrench from the region, and the alliance with South Korea may weaken, which will give them the future chance.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are already 10 minutes behind the schedule. But I will have just one or two questions, from audience. But before I invite questions, maybe I have today. There are too many, genuine experts in this room on these issues, and there are many supervisors. So especially I'd like to recognize the participation of the former head of our six-party talk, Ambassador Chen Young-woo. Maybe at last moment, after the question and answers finished, I'd like to invite you just for a short, comment. Okay. I know the lady. Kim Do-yeon. Yes. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for all your insightful comments. I have two quick questions for Professor Jang To-sheng. You mentioned that you'd like to see more technical data provided to China on THAAD. My understanding has been that senior Obama administration officials, and Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding has been that Washington has offered to provide a technical briefing and Beijing has denied or rejected those offerings. And then later, there have been some discussions on the technicalities or the technical configurations of that. And so I'm curious, today, has Beijing officially asked for more information? And my second question is, on your proposal to convene 5-party talks and leave the chair for North Korea if they want to join, conventional wisdom has always been that the notion of 5-party talks, which has been an idea floated by many experts in the NGO community in Washington, the conventional wisdom has been that China and even Russia would not come to the table if North Korea was not present. So is your sense and understanding today that Beijing would now be willing to engage in a 5-party discussion without North Korea on these issues? Thank you.
Okay, next.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'm Yves Tiberghien from USC British Columbia, and we probably are the institute with the most sustained engagement with North Korea. We have this regular flow of scholars, etc. And what we hear from North Korean sources essentially is, number one, that the current move toward this capability is very different from the early 2000s or the 90s, where there was clearly an IR logic, either bargaining logic or a security threat issue preventing regime change. This time it seems to be really associated with Kim Jong-un's consolidation of regime consolidation, demonstration of leadership to domestic audiences. That's why everything is orchestrated around him. Pushing the buttons, and then Moronbong is doing this music, with the beautiful missile destroying the earth, etc. And so if that's the logic, then it's sort of unstoppable. That is, the IR incentives will not touch it. And that would mean the entire discussion is moot. That is, in 2 or 3 years, here we will have North Korea with ICBM, with their SLBMs and nuclear capability. Nothing will affect it. So then do we have to get ready for this? No, is it really moot? And my side question was, we hear a lot about this cyber capability left of launch. Is that the golden weapon that could stop it? Or are we otherwise, in a smooth world where it's going to happen?
Okay, I'd like to invite.
Well, thank you for giving me the floor, despite my responsibility for failure of diplomacy as a nuclear negotiator. Well, looking forward, well, fortunately, no one has succeeded, so that's my comfort. Well, I think looking forward, I think we may have to, together with the maximum pressure, we may have to lower the threshold of dialogue, not to be too onerous in meeting requirements for resumption of dialogue. But I think what is important is North Korea's commitment to the goal of denuclearization. And because otherwise, we may play into the game of legitimizing their nuclear armament. Even though the immediate goal or practical goal may be freeze, whether we achieve freeze in the context of the ultimate goal of denuclearization, or whether we take it as an end in itself, that may have totally different implications for the future. Because if it is just the end goal, what it means for us is that, okay, it's okay as long as you do not have capabilities to hit continental U.S. with nuclear weapons. It's okay to possess capabilities to attack ROK Japan. This is not going to be the message that we have to send to North Korea. So we have to make it we have to require even an indirect commitment to denuclearization with a commitment to September 19 joint statement. If they are not going to be explicit in their commitment to denuclearization, we need some way of putting a broader context of the negotiation process. And when it comes to freeze, I think it's one thing to freeze a known facilities. Another thing to include undeclared facilities. Because if we are going to freeze only the Yongbyon facilities, this is a partial freeze. What that means is that it's okay if you can reduce just production of one nuclear weapon a year from 2 to 1 or 3 to 2. As long as you reduce, the capability is okay. Well, it may make difference.
Create serious consequence by conventional forces. So this is, the North Korea should really think about it. Yeah. So they have this kind of capability. But maybe Japan have more concerns about the missile. And so this is a very complicated issue. Anyway, I hope all parties to think it, find a good way for all our common interests. And another thing is why we have so huge concern about South Korea's threat, deployment, not Japan. I can tell you several things. First, we don't have good relationship with Japan. We have very bad relationship. But last year, at that time, in the past, we have very good relationship with Korea. So during a period of time, the Chinese government believe
we expected too much.
yeah. We can persuade South Korea not to do so. And especially South Korea always told us 3 no's. We haven't had any formal consultation with the United States. We haven't made any decision. There is no timetable, something like that. So maybe the government has a misunderstanding of this. They think, okay, maybe under the pressure, you will not do that. But you do that with United States just before the arbitration ruling, 2 days before that. So at that time, Chinese leaders feel very angry about that. Yeah. So this is the communication problem also. And finally, I think you said about the 5-party talks. U.S. Proposed again and again in the past when North Korea withdrew from the 6-party talks. But I think this time is different. And very early at that time, when you see now South Korea just have a new administration. And China and the U.S. So relationship is better than expected. And the 2 leaders even reach some important consensus when they meet each other. So we should have a try. But you see, in the before, last year, at that time, especially China and the U.S. have a serious frictions in the South China Sea. And the situation is a little bit different. So we hope we can have some new thinking. And finally, I want to say is maybe U.S. and South Korea can take the lead to do something. I mean the security commitment. So last year, China will not accept it. But maybe this year, it could be a good signal for China. And when Xi Jinping talked with Moon, the new President Moon, they said we should respect and honor each other's security concern. So that's a chance. Yeah, we should think about it.
I'm hungry and I will pass.
If I'm forced to make a choice, 1 out of 2, that is professional pessimism or cautious optimism. So I prefer cautious optimism because for the first time, during the recent, nuclear deal history, China and the United States take these issues with top priority. So we should not lose this invaluable chance. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for your great tolerance till last moment. Thank you.